Joining us now, Maria Teresa Kumar, President and CEO of Voto Latino, an MSNBC contributor. Also with us, Steve Bell, former Republican staff director of the Senate Budget Committee and a senior advisor at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And also joining us, Ron Klain, former chief of staff to Vice Presidents Biden and Gore and a former senior aide to President Obama. Maria Teresa, I want to go to you first on the pardon of Joe Arpaio and the way the president talks about Joe Arpaio, who, by accepting the pardon, has admitted guilt to what he was charged with, but he has a history of much more than what he was charged with, and that's a history that the president ignores.
Absolutely. Well, the DOJ had found that he basically had violated the Constitution under the Eighth Amendment for cruel and unusual punishment. This is a sheriff who prided himself on running his tent cities like concentration camps. The number of hangings that occurred in his camp with people under detention was unprecedented. He would shackle women while giving childbirth. I mean, it goes on. And the fact that the Maricopa County voters voted him out, they voted him out because they were tired of not only the fact that he was basically terrorizing a whole group of people based on the color of their skin, because it was willy-nilly. It was just this, it was the guise of immigration reform. But he was also costing the taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars trying to do these erroneous efforts while not pursuing true crimes. He had close to over 400 backlogs of sex crime investigations that were failed to go unnoticed, and many of them were children. So the list goes on. And this idea that he was doing his job, no, he wasn't. And what President Trump just did, he basically threw the book at the Constitution because he prevented the judicial branch of government, of checks and balances, to fully do their job.
And Ron Klain, this intervening between a verdict, basically, and sentencing is something we haven't seen before.
You're right, Lawrence. You mentioned that before, but it's an unprecedented intervention by a president in the judicial process for no reason other than the fact that he likes Joe Arpaio's politics. Joe Arpaio was a birther, and Trump tweeted gratitude for him for raising the false claim that President Obama wasn't born in this country. He is a racist. He's a white supremacist. And that's basically the case President Trump was making at this press conference today. You know, he agrees with them. He thinks he's a good guy, and therefore he gave him a pardon. Well, he isn't a good guy. And, you know, this was a series of constitutional violations the Justice Department began to document under President George W. Bush that were further investigated under President Obama. And as you said, were finally prosecuted under the Trump presidency. So there is no basis for this pardon. It was an extraordinary act. And there's just no justification for what the president did. And his statement today that he did it during the middle of a hurricane because he thought it would get better ratings on cable is either tortured or a lie, or really both. And
it goes without saying, I mean, literally goes without saying, that Joe Arpaio would never have been pardoned if he were not a Trump supporter. And I mean, that's just not mentioned very much in all of this because we take it so for granted that, of course, to get a pardon from Donald Trump, you would have to be a Trump supporter. And past presidents have always been very careful and afraid of being associated with pardoning people who were their supporters. I mean, they've done it. But it's not something that most presidents want to be caught doing. Steve Bell, to the president's notion that it's going to be very easy, very quick to get all of this hurricane funding lined up.
Oh, I think it's the same way he said that we were going to have a tax bill by August. Even earlier than that, we were going to have a great tax bill. But the fact of the matter is this. They don't have very much time, depending on how you want to count, 12 to 17 days of congressional action before the 1st of October. They have a number of things they have to get done. The primary one is to increase the debt ceiling before early October. Probably have to do that in mid-September sometime. They don't have a budget, as you pointed out, for fiscal year 18, which starts on October 1st. And I think what they're going to have to do is look the president in the eyeball and say, now, wait a minute. You said you would not accept a spending bill that didn't fund the wall. Does that mean if we send you a spending bill, you will veto it despite the fact that the federal government's money and help is absolutely essential to the recovery to those people who are victims of Hurricane Harvey? And that's going to be an interesting question for the president about 30 days from now to have to consider. And,
Ron, in the past, hurricane funding has taken sometimes several months for Congress to act on. It didn't used to be that way, but starting around 2005, there were some Republicans led by Mike Pence in the House of Representatives who started to say, look, if you're going to do disaster funding like this, you must make other cuts in the budget to make up for whatever money you're spending in disaster funding. Prior to that, it used to be understood to be an emergency and something that the government was just going to have to spring into action on without cutting out other spending.
Yeah, Lawrence, this is a great country, and people in this country want to help one another, and that crosses party lines and it crosses regional lines. But a few years ago, the Republicans decided to politicize that, and Mike Pence said we should cut Medicare, cut old senior citizens' health care and poor people's health care through Medicaid to pay for disaster relief, a ridiculous position. And now he's our vice president. We're going to see what he recommends. I think the key thing here is I think Donald Trump will pass the bar of tweeting about the storm and flying on Air Force One, but this is going to take weeks and months and years, long after his Twitter feed has moved on. And the test of presidential leadership in this kind of situation is, does he have the focus, the consistent focus to oversee and drive this recovery to its end? And I think that's where President Trump sadly will fail the test of leadership on Hurricane Harvey.
And Maria Teresa, to Ron's point, that seems to me to be exactly why the very first question to the president today was about the long-term recovery plan for Hurricane Harvey. Not what are you going to do this week, next week, but the long-term plan. And any talk of government shutdown, anything like that, and feuding with members of Congress, as the questioner pointed out, jeopardizes that.
That's right. I mean, this president so far in the last 7 months, he's been shooting from the hip. And this requires someone who is disciplined, strategic, who's filling the jobs in those federal agencies that he has yet to completely do. And he can't propose the budget that he originally had, which was basically slashing the National Guard, slashing FEMA, slashing disaster. And this is actually a testament of why we actually need those programs. And we need the right type of civil servant in those positions, because we cannot calculate when the next natural disaster will take place. And he needs to be disciplined. So hopefully Kelly being in there will enable him to actually have some sort of discipline, but it's a hard shot.
Steve, having worked in the Senate on the Republican side of the budgeting process, you know how Mitch McConnell thinks about these things. Do you expect Leader McConnell to wrap all of the difficult issues up into one package so that it's one vote, essentially, on the debt ceiling, on the budget, and on hurricane relief?
You know, I think that's a real possibility. When you don't have enough time, the thing you have to do, and this sounds like Yogi Berra, is create more time. And they have they really do have the ability to do that. If they want to have a short-term continuing resolution for spending for the government, let's say through the end of December, and if they want to have a short-term debt extension to the end of December, then they can probably work out, and I think this is what Mr. McConnell would like to do, would be able to work out the funding for the government, the first part of the funding for what is going to be a very expensive Hurricane Harvey recovery, and very long, by the way, as you pointed out, and to get things like the National Defense Authorization Act passed and flood insurance reauthorized and things like that. So they need time, and my suspicion is that Leader McConnell, who cares about keeping the majority in the Senate above most anything else, I think he'll probably say, look, give us 90 days up here, Mr. President. Don't veto a bill that doesn't have funding for it, for the wall. And please, let's do this in a logical way. And I think there's a real possibility that he'll do that. Now, the question is this. Will the president, who thought he got tricked earlier this year when he went ahead with the FY17 budget with no money for the wall, will he say, no, once shame on you, twice shame on me, and veto it, which would, of course, would be a catastrophic political mistake?
Well, we're going to find out. Steve Bell takes his position now beside Yogi Berra and the great quotes of our time. If you're running out of time, create more time. Maria Teresa Kumar, Ron Klain, Steve Bell, thank you all for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.